Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about like an abortion argument. See what you thought about it.
Watch
It's
this
very
shit.
hard.
Watch this argument.
What the hell?
Watch
Whose
this
mic is
argument.
that?
What the hell? What the hell?
I said, yo, who
It was this one.
You're corny, bro.
Who the fuck said what the hell, bro?
Bro, listen. Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening.
Yeah. So the first premise within the argument, all it says is that for any organism X, like if it exists at time A and does not die at any point after time A, then the organism will exist.
This shit already at
Time A.
nigga put FF. What the fuck is it? FF?
It's long as shit. I want to
It
hear.
represents the fetus, right?
You said what?
I was answering this question. It represents the fetus, bro. Just read. It literally says it in premise 2. It says,
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm lazy as fuck. I'm not reading all that shit. Yeah, I'm not.
Bro,
Why are you talking? Yo, I got nothing of value to put on this fucking subject. I'm gonna talk anyway, bro. Like what?
What?
He said he
What is
don't
going
read.
on?
He said he's not reading all that. It's like, let me put my input in, bro.
There's no need to read if a person's already reading it out. You see,
You just said you're not reading all that though.
I'm reading it. Like he's reading it out to us. I don't really get no fuck.
You gotta popcorn read that shit, bro. We gotta get y'all reading.
Yeah, hell nah.
Yeah, that one.
Born to be murdered. Shut the fuck up. Man, my morals are different from everybody else, right? So boom, I'll walk up.
If you're a monoclone, nigga.
I was gonna say some diabolical right now.
Like,
wait, do I ignore the point 1 and point 2? Or
point two?
You said what?
Are you from Baltimore?
no, I said I'm assuming I ignore the point 1 or point 2.
Are you from Baltimore? You said 2.
Tell me what you think about it, bro.
I'm not from Baltimore.
Yeah.
Be Archie. This nigga gotta be Archie. Babe.
Bro, who are you
Is
talking
this nigga
about?
dumb?
Stop
Yo.
sounding crazy, bitch. Watch your tone. But
Who
anyway,
the fuck is Archie, man?
Okay.
Like, who's what?
I don't know who that random is, but I feel like numerically identical. What exactly do you mean by numerically identical?
When you say numerically identical, we're just saying that the entity or the fucking the thing developed. So
you can't.
Yeah, it's like shit.
But your mic cut out. What do you say at the end?
yeah, so we're saying that the fetus developed into me like as one entity.
I think there's, from what I'm reading at least, because I didn't speed read, but maybe I'm missing something. I'm not really sure how you would justify that it's the same as you in any identical sense other than being a proper part of me. Because it said that it's either a proper part of you or it's numerically identical. And it kind of sounds like that just is what numerically identical means in this instance. That is like a proper part of you. Am I misunderstanding?
No. What you said, when we're saying numerically identical, that's the same thing as saying it's a proper part?
Honestly, I'm not really sure what the distinction would be, at least in this context.
Oh, so, I believe the justification was, if I fucking remember it, let me think. Yeah, so the justification for that would be, well, if we were to say that fetus is merely a part of me, then that would be like saying me as a child is only a part of me as an adult. And it seems much more feasible to say that me as a child developed into me as an adult, and we're still one in the same organism.
Like, on some perfect cell type shit.
Abortion.
But wouldn't like a proper part only represent a certain portion and not the entirety, right?
Yeah, like all the properties are true of a fetus. I just believe you would say that that the properties of a fetus wouldn't be true for you currently, but rather they were just developed into what you are now.
I think someone would be like, at least from my perspective, I think if someone were to argue against this, they'd probably start being like really pedantic to kind of dance around it, and they'd probably start saying that there's a differentiating, or that there's a possibility that there could be a differentiating set of parts compared to the adult when it does develop into another adult, that they'd probably ask you to prove that possibility would be succeeded, at least in majority instances or most.
Y'all debating or no?
No, I have a discussion.
No. It's not that big. I was
trying to tell him what he thinks about like the race hall argument, because a response to that, Rizhan made this shit, nigga.
He Chat GPT made it. That's every time Rizhan says he made something, Chat GPT.
Yo, where low key, or he just copy and pasted that shit. Well, yeah. So someone's response to that for the pandemic point is that, well, if a fetus is a proper part of you, then the organism that was a fetus no longer exists as a whole, and only a part of it remains within you. But that would contradict P5, that the fetus still exists and thus continues to exist as a whole. Now, if if a whole organism becomes a part of a new organism, it's unclear whether it still exists in its own right, which it just contradicts its own premise required for the numerical identity.
Yeah.
And so someone would justify and say that, well, no precedent for organisms being proper part of others is just the case. Because while cells, organs, and systems can be proper part of an organism, like complete organisms, they are not like normally understood as parts of like other organisms in biological or metaphysical terms. For example, like a fetus inside of a uterus is not a part of the mother's fucking body in the same sense that her liver or arm is. It's just a distinct organism within its own genetic identity and integrity. Like similarly, it's strange to say like a fetus becomes a part of the adult it develops into. Rather, it just becomes that adult.
Yeah.
And then a nigga would say, well, that would also violate the transitivity of parthood, because parthood is typically transitive. Holy fuck, my nigga. Which is if A is a part of B and B is a part of C, then A is a part of C. But if the fetus were a proper part of you and your liver is also a part of you, it's unclear how the fetus, an entire organism, relates merologically to the rest of your parts. And that
wouldn't that inflict hormonal stuff though?
No.
Yeah, so it's basically saying that, well, numerical identity requires that there is one and the same thing, not just a continuity of parts, but the continuity of the subject. So if a fetus is merely a part of you, then you and the fetus are not identical because the parts are not identical to two wholes, and that violates whatever the fuck. Well, hold on. Yeah, it violates the transitivity part.
I mean, okay. I understand somewhat of the instance. Mereologically, yes, it would be like you in a mereological sense. But what if someone tries to argue that there is no true meaningful distinction that can be uniquely traced from another organism, such as the heart, the liver, the lungs, compared to the fetus? Would you argue potentiality in that instance?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in a lot of cases, but if someone argues that there's no meaningful distinction between the fetus and another organism, I think they'll likely be rejecting the idea that the fetus and the later adult are the same individual. And they might argue a fetus is an organism, you are an organism, but the mere fact that one developed from the other doesn't automatically imply a numerical identity. Right?
I mean, I could. I personally would say if someone tries to argue that, a more meaningful way to connect, at least from my perspective, if I was in their position and someone asked me, okay, well, what would be the difference between such a fetus and those organs? I'd probably argue their functionality. Obviously, organs and stuff like that, they produce nutrients, blood flow, and help regulate the body so it can move. But rather than that, the fetus is actually taking products, nutrients, and these things, and other organs are also helping that fetus regulate. So clearly there would be a different relationship that's meaningfully distinct, because it's using these properties just as much as the mother is, right? It's not helping the mother move. It needs the mother in that sense.
Yeah. So I was just about to bring up the point about the biological continuity of this, the same living body. like given what we know, like we routinely track individual organisms over time based on like the continuity of like biological processes. Like for example, a single zygote grows into a fetus, infant, child, yada yada, and no radical break, which would be like death, division, or fusion occurs, and it's within the same body with a continuous like metabolic and developmental like activity, which is just persistent. That's exactly the kind of thing that grounds numerical identity, like in many like contexts, like such as moral status. So unless there's a principled reason to deny this development as a basis for identity, then I think someone would say that, well, the burden is on the skeptic to show why the fetus isn't you. And the reason we don't treat other organisms that way, because you brought up a really good question earlier, is because we don't say a caterpillar and the resulting butterfly are different organisms, even though they change like, you know, radically and shit like that. Similarly, we wouldn't say a puppy and the resulting dog are different. We accept radical development change without the loss of identity because we have a robust like notion of the persistence of like the organisms and shit like that. So I would say personally, like if you aren't the fetus that developed into you, then where did you come from? Like when did you begin to exist? Which organism are you? Because without a new organism emerging from the fetus, the best explanation, like usually, is that just you're that organism. You're just a fetus once.
I see two potential refutations. Now, one I feel like someone who's more educated would use, but another I feel like it'd be a quick spit out. Someone, you know, kind of stress says in the middle of things. Now the stress says I feel like they would try to establish, like kind of use the kind of dance around it by using the definition of organism. Like imagine someone says, well, in this instance, when a puppy develops into a dog or when a caterpillar develops into a butterfly, yes, these things are still the same organisms, but when another organism, let's say, develops into like this apparent like X, like this apparent adult, right? They could potentially try to argue that the functionality changes and that one of the functionalities are like dependent compared to the other one being independent. Like for example, like a dog or something like that. So I'd probably just argue like a dog fetus. Obviously you can't use that for like a caterpillar or like anything like that because, you know, I don't think they have fetal phases. Maybe they do. I'm not educated on caterpillars. But for dogs and stuff like that, I probably just like dial the analogy more clearly, because a lot of people would try to kind of use that vagueness a little bit in your analogy to trying to like spike at a point.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. Yeah. So one thing I would say is that functional changes don't imply a new organism. It's like organisms change functionally all the time as a part of natural development. Like the caterpillar has like radically different functions than the butterfly, and the newborn lacks speech, reasoning, and moral agency, but it's still the same human organism like it was as a fetus. And elderly humans often lose functionality, and we don't say that they become like a new organism or just stop, because functional properties, for example, like cognition or respiration type, are accidental, not essential to an organism's identity over time. And for the claim that dependency, for the dependency one, well, I would just say, well, it's literally irrelevant to numerical identity because organisms at early stages of life are always dependent. That's just a part of biological development. Like a baby on a ventilator is more dependent than a fetus, but that doesn't mean that baby is no longer the same organisms. And Siamese twins or some shit, like some twins maybe depend on each other biologically, yet we don't say that they're parts of a single organism or their identities are blurred. And some people will just say that dependency is just a relational property, not an identity breaking one. And then for the definition, because I know people like to dance over like, you know, rat definitions and shit. Well, the standard for organism identity is just a biological continuity. Like the best criteria for saying an organism is the same over time is whether its biological processes like metabolism, growth, self-regulation continue without interruption, and that there's no division, fusion, or replacement by another organism. So that continually implies from zygote and then to embryo to fetus to infant adult, and there's no meaningful break in that process. So one would just argue that like it is the same organism despite the changes in the function or dependency.
That's a very good refutation. And for the next one, this is one that I see usually more, at least more like scholarly debates use. When people try to establish an identity factor between someone at one state in their life compared to another. A lot of people argue that this breaks and kind of shifts around and kind of picks at certain meanings of identity, but doesn't encompass the whole. Like someone may say, okay, well, if a property, let's say a person, when they're 7, for example, right? They have all their functional body parts, everything like that, and that is established with them, right? Those are all essential parts, at least in their identity. And then, like, let's say about 40 years later, their leg gets amputated. Let's say they their eyesight isn't very well, and that there are biological distinctions. People would argue that they are meaningfully distinct in the set of their properties. What would you say towards that?
And the set. You cut out in the middle there. So I was at if a property person has other functional body parts, those are all essential parts for 40 years later. It's amputated. Like if someone's like arm is amputated like 40 years later, people will argue they're distinct.
Well, yeah. I kind of went away with. I kind of was picking at someone's particular analogy. So I watched a debate about a couple of days ago, but it's really just this. Like someone says that a person at X amount of time or at an X event, a person has a particular set of parts that make them. At, let's say, Y event, let's say 40 years down the line, some parts are altered and changed of that thing. People would argue, or at least some people, I'm not sure if this is, actually it is kind of popular on the pro-choice side, people would argue that these people are distinct in the sense that parts and sets of them that make them are completely different. And since their organisms and biological functions are functioning differently, they probably would ask you to explain in what sense they share an identity. Because if they don't share an identity as a whole, and it's only a mere logical part of that identity, they would argue that they are not the same by any means, because that same similarity can be shared between others.
Yeah. So the objection. So we can just like simplify this in like logical terms. So we could just say at time T1, a person P1, let's say, that has a certain set of parts or properties, right? And at time T2, like for example, 40 years later, they have a different set. Maybe many parts have changed. Therefore, they are not the same person or organism because parts that made them are now different. Well, that just blatantly mistakes change for replacement of identity. Nearly every entity changes over time, including people, trees, rivers, and even organisms. Change in parts or properties doesn't mean change in numerical identity. For example, a person can change over every cell in their body over 7 to 10 years, but it's still them throughout, not a new person every decade. And that argument would destroy identity across all time. Like if having different parts at different times made you a different person, then it's just going to follow that you're not the same person as you were yesterday. You shed skin cells and your thoughts have changed, and you weren't the same person during childhood, adolescence, adulthood, because the sense of the parts was always shifting, and that would lead to an absurdity, and you can never be held morally or legally responsible for anything you did in the past. And identity over time is based on continuity, not like sameness. Identity doesn't mean sameness of material, but continuity of the same life or the organizational structure. Like organisms persist as the same entity by maintaining a unified self-regulating biological process. Persons persist by maintaining a continuity of consciousness, memory, or agency, depending on your theory of personhood. So even if all the parts change, the organizing principle, the living body, or the person remains the same individual. Now, the ship of Theseus doesn't refute the identity. It just reveals it. And that's essentially a version of the ship Theseus paradox. Like, if you replace all the parts of a ship over time, is it still the same ship? A lot of philosophers would argue that, yes, if the changes are gradual and the structure is preserved. But similarly, a person who changes over time biologically or mentally is still the person because there is no sudden break and no replacement organism. And sets of parts are descriptive, not definitive. So saying the sets of parts is different is true descriptively, but it doesn't mean the identity changed. And the concept of a set of parts is static and abstract, but organisms are dynamic living systems, not just collections. Like, for example, you aren't like a Lego model made of fixed bricks. You're a living being whose parts are constant, like regulated change. That's the nature of life. So I would say personally, like, the objection fails because it assumes numerical identity requires sameness of parts, but identity over time is just preserved through biological or personal continuity, not fixed material composition. If different parts made a different person, there would be no stable self, which contradicts experience, ethics, and just like common sense.
That's a very good refutation. The only thing I would say towards that is that a lot of people, I personally call this the ask yourself method. What if they end up like biting the bullet, right? And then they say, okay, that's completely fine. I'm completely fine with admitting that we are different people each and every single day. And they bite that bullet just to save themselves. And then also, one thing I did notice, this isn't particularly bad because, I mean, personally, I agree with you for the most part, but when you identify or when you define identity as that, generally, unless you have like a citation or you have a denotation, to which maybe you do, I don't recall. That doesn't sound very familiar. I mean, it's how I personally define identity in my head, but people would generally try to ask you, okay, to prove that is actually how we share identity, because then they'd probably just try to use some dumb shit like, oh well, I mean, all we know identity has is A equals A. How do I know that I have to agree to the rest of what you said? You know, like a little pedantic shit like that.
Yeah, it's that bullshit. For me personally, I would just define identity like index to biologics and still uphold A equals A. And that's just what you brought up is the radical skeptical challenge. So the identity A equals A, right? It's a logical principle, not a definition of persistence. Like the claim identity is just A equals A is just a tautology. So it means something is the same as itself at a given time. But that doesn't help us with the persistence over time, right? Which is the real question. We're not asking, is a thing the same as itself, right? But rather, is this thing now the same as it was before? So that's not definitional. It's just explanatory. It requires criteria, for example, continuity or organization, memory to determine. Now, if someone demands absolute metaphysical proof that this person now is the same as the person fucking 40 years ago, because me and you both know that niggas like to ride in his ass, dumb shit like this. Like, so you said, like, do you believe you're the same person who stated this conversation? And if they do, everyone lives as though personal identity over time is real, even if they can't prove it with a metaphysical certainty. So you could say that via the priors is more so baked into memory, planning, regret, or moral responsibility in relationships. And they presume identity daily. If they're rejected now, they must reject all of that, which is just absurd. And I would also say that continuity is the best explanation for the persistence, and you can't. And for that, I would say that you can't deduce identity from logic. You must infer it from like evidence, which would be like no other organism replaced me, and I remember my past, and my body and mind changed gradually, not suddenly. And I would say that I have like a moral commitments like stretching back decades, and I would say that. Well, the best explanation for these facts is that I am the same individual, not a different A every time something changes. Now, if they bite the bullet, like you said, they abandon reason itself. Because if a nigga insists that there's no such thing as identity over time, then we're always new entities, then all reasoning would collapse. Like who was arguing now is not who made the argument a sentence ago. And literally all science collapses because no ongoing process can be tracked, and all ethic collapses because no one can be responsible for past actions, and the bullet they're biting explodes into their fucking mouth, and the ability to say anything meaningful, including that identity, is just A equals A. And then I would also say that like identity is just like a metaphysical assumption, like causality or time. Like identity over time is not something proven like a math equation. It's just like a necessary background condition for thought, language, and responsibility. That's what I would say. I would also say like if they throw that out, then they're not engaging like in the rational debate. Like they're just dissolving the grounds it stands on. So saying identity is just A equals A, like I think I would say that was like irrelevant to the real question of what makes someone the same over time.
That's exactly what I was just about to say. Like I was gonna say instead of saying, I mean, you can say all of that, like obviously, especially for more optical points. But I would say if you're working with a crowd that's kind of a little retarded and their attention span's kind of slow and they don't like fully know how to track, I would just say this: the response with A equals A If someone were to bring that up to me while I was trying to argue such identity, I would simply say I'm completely fine with the fact that E equals A, because the establishment of A being equivalent to A does not speak of the parameters on what actually establishes that equivalence, right? You guys don't disagree on the fact that there is a sameness. You just disagree on what that sameness actually is and how different things have to be to actually qualify for it not being the same. So when someone says that, they're not actually responding to you.
Yeah. But yeah, man. I just want to know what you would think about that shit. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I had formulated it a bit better, but I mean, it seems like a pretty solid argument for the most part. I mean,
yeah. I'll delete the video, but what the fuck? Potato, you can get unmuted. I don't know why you muted. What's good, Wi-Fi? What you doing, gang?
wait, actually, I'm glad Wi-Fi's here. Wait, Wi-Fi, do you study physics in any sense?
Yo, nigga.
I just want to ask him a few questions regarding it, because I think he's